Yeah. Okay, if we just begin with a word of prayer. Dear God in heaven, I thank you for this Sabbath day that we have finally come to after a long week. I thank you for being able to meet up with our friends in Holland and that we will be able to share your word. I pray that you will bless us with your Holy Spirit in understanding these important studies that you have given us. May we not neglect it or take it for granted, but may we accept these truths in our hearts and live them in our lives. Please be with us in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. So this presentation from Tess is called The Three Structures. And in the beginning, I'll just go quickly through a short, what do you call it? 𝗂𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗏. I'll just revisit some of the things that you mentioned last time. And I'll just show you a picture that I took from the presentation because I didn't want to write it on the board because we use it. I'll only use it for like 2 or 5 minutes or something. But if you remember, this was the structure. Night defined. This is. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the structure that she was talking about last time. And the point of her talking about the structure this time is to really revisit the point about where we are in history. So back in when this study was made was in 2021. Yeah, in 2021. And at that point in time, we were right here on the priest line between the increase of knowledge and the formalization. And on the 144,000 line, we're in the I think this is the this is the early rain. And in this period, and on the priest line, we're in the harvest. But the point she's trying to make here is that back then in February, on the I'll just have to find my notes. When we look on the big line, I'll just show it again. Right here. I'll just hold it like this. So on this line, we begin, we have the increase of knowledge between February and August. And every waymark is a period of time, and we've learned that in several ways, or seen it in several studies. And in February, when the increase of knowledge began, we didn't begin studying the Millerite history in 1844, but we went to the history of 1888, and afterwards we went to understand the Millerite history back when the sin of America was slavery. But the point of taking us to the Millerite history, or to the 1888 history, is to make us understand the Sunday law, because this increase of knowledge is talking about the Sunday law, so we're trying to understand that history. And if we also, when we started to understand the history of 1888, what this history is saying indirectly to us was that we think and we say we love 1888, the history of 1888, but the problem is that we don't understand the external events of that time, and hereby I mean the works of A.T. Jones and his companions in working against the Sunday laws back then. And if we take and apply the the structure of that history, or the understanding of the external event from that history, if we take those and apply to our time, we will see that Adventism would have failed in the same circumstances. And we see that in the history of 2014 of gay marriage, where Adventism are just lost, and in that they're on the wrong way, on the wrong path. Yeah. And so after February and the increase of knowledge on the big line, then in August, after we have understood the whole history of 1888, God takes us back to Millerite history, to show us that 1888, where the sin of America was, church and state relationship. God takes us back to Millerite history and shows us that the sin of America back then was different, and that it was actually slavery. So the point that is trying to be made is that the Sabbath is not the sin, and thereby by understanding that the Sunday laws are, that we have Sunday laws, but we also have the whole history of slavery. By understanding these two in combination, we understand that our history of Sunday law is totally different. So by understanding these histories, we have the increase of knowledge on our own Sunday law. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, and just to make a small point also, as we see on the picture here, we have an increase of knowledge here on two histories, but the increase of knowledge is a period. And back on the line of the priests, we also have a increase of knowledge with a period of time which starts in May and ends in September, which is all about the 𝗶𝗶𝗃𝗲𝗏. Yeah. So I'll just make a line. I'll just make the time of the end line. And when Ellen White was writing, she said that she was in the time of the end, which was in 1798. And when we say, and everything that happens everything that has happened since 1798 is in the history of the time of the end. And there are several structures that takes us to the time of the end. And Tess in this presentation wanted to highlight three, which she thinks is the God-given structures to really explain this time period. What happens in between and what leads us to the time of the end in our time also. And these three structures, the first one is modern Israel. And I'll just and each of these three histories are also divided into three parts. And the first part of this history is from 1798 till 1844. So yeah, this is the history of the Millerites. And the second part of this history is the one about, as I mentioned before, 1888. So this was about slavery, as we remember. And this was about the Sunday laws, or church and state relationship. And the last one is our history, or the 144,000 history. And we know this history is about sexism, equality. Yeah, I don't know if anyone remembers the second one.
𝗃𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗄?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this is the period of Pope Pius XII, which was from 1899 till 1945. And during this time period, we also have the First and the Second World War. And the Third World War is back in our time, which begins in 2001. And I don't know if it's an important point for this study's purpose, but Tess mentioned that if Christ would have come back in this time, and in the, I guess he's talking about this time period, the papacy wouldn't have, had its power, or wouldn't have gotten its power, because it wasn't strong back then. She just mentioned it, and maybe I just mentioned it because maybe it meant something to you in relation to this study. But yeah, I just mentioned it. Maybe it didn't make sense. Yeah, and yeah, so the second part of the history of the counterfeit is in 1988 or 1989. Yeah, 1989. And at this period, we see that the Soviet Union fall. The fall of the Soviet Union. And if we remember the whole story about Fatima, we remember that there's this whole story about having to, that we want to, I don't remember if the word is to consecrate Russia. But that idea, or that wish, or that goal falls to the ground, because that the Soviet Union falls. So John Paul II, which is the Pope back then, his wish doesn't get fulfilled. Yeah. And the last period of time for the counterfeit is begins in 2001. And here we have Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, and also the beginning of the Third World War. And I just want to make a small side point, which I think it's profound, because as we see, all these time periods are some of them, of course, have 100 years apart, but this, for example, the time periods that Satan tries to, counterfeit God's movement is only here it's 64 years from 46. 46 years from 1798 to 1844, and here is also 46 years. And here, of course, it's what do you call it? Almost 100 years, and here it's the same time period. So even though that the time periods are very different, you know, we begin in the 1700s, and here we have the 1800s, and even though there are hundreds of years in between those, we all end in the same time period, and we will also see that with the third structure, which Tess calls "In God We Trust." So Emilis asks me to just explain why we have these three structures, and as I understood, we have these three structures are what you call a tool to understand this time period. And there are, of course, also other structures that some people mention in the study, but most often these structures are a further understanding of some of these structures. The only structure that maybe one structure that you could maybe call the fourth structure is the one about the wolves. But she really doesn't go into it. She just takes note of it and says, yeah, maybe that's interesting. But these are the main structures. So when she goes into this study, she only begins briefly on the study. In this study, she only begins briefly to go through the document called, what is it called? How the Constitution Became Christian. And in this document, it's very clear that there are three groups of people, or three groups of organizations, which will fill in these three parts. And the first one, we have the first movement here called the Christian Amendment movement. And that structure this begins in the 1863 and ends around 1900. I'll just and the second one is the Judeo-Christian Judeo-Christian nationalism. Judeo-Christian, and this, what do you call, I don't know how to say it. It's not like an institution, but
a movement.
Yeah, movement. This movement begins, we will just put 1950s, but it actually begins in the 40s. And this last one is called the New Christian Rights. The New Christian Right, and it begins in 1979 and goes all the way to the Sunday Law. And I didn't mention it earlier, which I should have, but the two first histories are histories of failure, and the last one is a history of success. And What did I want to say? When White talks, just a moment. It's because I cannot read my own handwriting. Okay, I cannot read it, but I know what the point is. So, the reason why, or not the reason why, but when White talks about these time periods, whether it be the one about slavery or the one about 1888, the reason why I point here is because the history of 1888 really revolves around this history, because it's between 1863 and 1900. You understand? Okay. So when Dwight talks about these histories, he really talks about them as being a success, or they will be a success, even though it's a history of failure. But the point is that for them, it could have been, Christ would have come back, and yeah, she also says the movements now in progress will, implement Sunday laws and so on, but it never happened. And since there was failure in the first history, in relation to the last structure about Protestantism, they have to mobilize again to succeed, but they fail again in the second history, and therefore they will try to mobilize again, and in the third history they will have success. I forgot to write this in the beginning, but of course this history up here is about Adventism, and this is about the papacy, and this is about Protestantism. Yeah, apostate Protestantism. Yeah. And since we have gone over in other studies, we have covered the history of Adventism and the papacy. In this camp meeting, or in these studies, she'll begin to cover the history of the new Christian, of in God we trust. Yeah, and this history is really about making America a Christian nation, whether it be through this way of working in the first, second, or third part. They work differently with the Constitution, or how to make America Christian. Yeah, and I don't know if all of you have the document. It's okay if you don't have the document, How the Constitution Became Christian, right beside you, but I'll just read through, not the introduction, but it's a small introduction. No. Kan du gøre det? I'll just share the document in Zoom so you can read with me. Or Emilis will do it. So you don't have to find it yourselves. Den øverste.
5, 4, 3, 6, 9, 2, 2.
Den Sluk helt ud.
Recording in progress.
It's okay now? No, it's not.
There's
No.
echo.
I'll just...
Du er muted.
Can you not... kan du ikke slukke lyden helt?
You still hear an echo.
Yeah. We also hear it.
Oh.
It's better. I think it's okay now.
Share screen.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'll just share my screen. Hov. Hvorhen?
Den grønne. Start.
Okay. So what we'll do is that we'll just read over this page, and then we'll go to page 262 at the end, and also 263. But this document is it's made out of 3 chapters, and the first one is called "The Fight to Make the Constitution Christian," where we will be talking about the movement in the very beginning, and then we'll go to the second movement called the Judeo-Christian nationalism of the Eisenhower era, and at the end we will go to the constitutional nationalism of the new Christian right, which is basically the movement of our time.
Skal jeg læse meget?
Lidt.
Jeg tror ned for lystikken. Den er på 10%. Den dør hurtigt, og det er skærm.
Okay. So I'll just begin to read. Yeah. Okay, so it says, movements dedicated to make the United States a Christian nation have been a recurrent feature in American politics for more than 150 years. Over that time, however, the relationship between Christian nationalism and the Constitution has undergone a dramatic change. 19th century Christian nationalists denounced the Constitution as a godless document, unworthy of a Christian nation, and fought for an amendment to express the nation's Christian faith. So here, I don't know if you can still see my screen or see me with the whiteboard, but here we talk about the first movement from 1863 to the 1900s, and as the text says, they believe the Constitution to be a godless document. And then it continues. In contrast, the contemporary Christian right that coalesced in the 1970s lauds the Constitution as the highest expression of the nation's Christian identity. So here we're talking about the last one from 1979 until the Sunday Law. And this movement really believes that the Constitution is Christian and has always, or it doesn't say that it has always been Christian, but I think we can conclude from different sources that we have seen, whether it be in the news or somewhere else, that they talk about the Constitution as being Christian from the very foundation. Yeah? I'll continue to read. It says, this article asks how the Constitution became, for many Americans at least, Christian. The answer lies in America's constitutional culture, which channels conflicts over national identity into constitutional disputes. The Constitution is conventionally portrayed as the embodiment of what it means to be American, but it is more accurate to describe the Constitution as the battleground over which disputes over national identity are fought. Yeah. And so what it says that when we talk, or when these movements talk about the Constitution, they are really talking about what it means to be American, because they see the Constitution as the core of what an American identity is. Yeah. I'll continue. This article illustrates the dynamics that transform conflicts over national identity into the constitutional conflicts by examining three movements in the long-standing debate over whether the United States should be understood to be a Christian nation. The 19th century Christian Amendment movement, mid-20th century Judeo-Christian nationalism, and the new Christian right that began in the 1970s and 1980s. Although these movements differ in significant ways, they follow a similar pattern. In each case, members of the dominant religious group mobilizes in response to perceived threats to their status from Catholics, immigrants, communists, and secular humanists. In each episode, members of the mobilized movement believed Christian devotion to be part of America's essence, and therefore considered threats to Christian dominance as attacks on America itself. And in each case, the movement attempted to preserve the nation's supposed Christian identity by making constitutional demands, either to amend the Constitution to proclaim the nation's Christian devotion or to interpret the Constitution to be Christian. So what this paragraph is really doing is saying that when it says similar patterns, we can also say, there are parables, there are lines that you can lay above each other because they follow a similar structure. And in each of these three three periods of time, or three movements, they always... What? Oh, sorry, I thought you said something. I was saying, and that in each of these movements, they always mobilize because they believe that, America's essence should be Christian devotion, and they always see that there's a threat against them and they want to counteract it. And I think the most important point here in this paragraph is that when they want to counteract, the groups and make the Constitution Christian, is that either they proclaim the nation's, or they proclaim that the Constitution is Christian, or they interpret the Constitution to be Christian. And that is really what we see in these, in the first movement, the Christian Amendment movement. As I mentioned earlier, they believed that the Constitution was Christian, or that it was not Christian, that it was godless, and therefore they wanted to amend it. And when we go to the last movement, the new Christian right, they believe that the Constitution is Christian, and therefore they don't need to amend it. They just need to interpret it in a Christian way. I'll just continue reading. Through this reoccurring pattern in which a threat to group status is understood in nationalist terms and motivates a movement that makes constitutional demands, fights about what it means to be American become fights over the meaning of the Constitution. Rather than embodying what it means to be American, the Constitution provides a seemingly neutral and patriotic language for making claims of national inclusion and exclusion, for asserting that some people and some values are authentically American, while others are dangerous foreign and must be rejected. So I'll just go over this part and go directly to page 262, where the author begins to talk about these three groups, which is our focus, of course. I'll begin at the sentence that's, as the article begins to show. As this article begins to show, the relationship between the Constitution and the national identity is quite different than conventional wisdom suggests. Rather than defining what it means to be American, the Constitution has been the battleground on which disputes over national identity are fought. In the nation's countless conflicts over the national identity, the Constitution has served as a magic mirror upon which we gaze and see ourselves. Some find the Constitution confirmation that the nation is committed to a set of universal ideals, though what those ideals consist of depends on the viewer. Libertarians read a libertarian constitution, while progressives read a progressive constitution. Others find the Constitution confirmation that the nation is defined by race, ethnicity, and religion. Nativists read a nativist constitution, while white supremacists read a white constitution. I think this point is really interesting because I think it makes sense to why people can read the Constitution so differently. Like, we can argue about what the Constitution is, but as long as we don't see them with the same glasses, we won't have a consensus, or we won't be able to agree on what the Constitution consists of. Side 262. Was there a point? And so, of course, since the Constitution is, I don't know if you could say subjective, it can be subjective in the sense of, that these movements all see it as a Christian document. They see it in a Christian document, or they want it to be this Christian document because they wear this pair of glasses. And Tess mentioned a really interesting point from Obama, where he says that the Constitution is the star that everybody wants to follow. But the point of it is that the star is in constant motion. He says that the Constitution is a flawed document from the very beginning, and we have to make the right amendments. And to that, I don't know if Emilis already mentioned the series on Netflix that's called, what is it called, Emilis? Amend? Yeah, a series called Amend. I don't know if he mentioned it, but it's a really good series on how the Constitution has been amended in relation to racism and sexism, and how, that Black people were not a part of what, they were not a group included in the Constitution when it was written, and therefore they had the 14, and therefore there were made amendments, and even so, we watched a part of the series yesterday about sexism, or about women gaining or a woman become. It was about how women wanted, equality in the society between men and women, and how they wanted to be included in the Constitution. So therefore, they wanted to have an amendment called the reproductive. Equal Rights Amendment. That's what it's called. So ERA. That they wanted that, and because they wanted to be included in the constitution. And I think it was interesting because this amendment, it was almost passed. It had to 38 states had to vote for it to be there had to be 38 states to have it ratified, but there was a backlash back in their time, and it was only ratified here in 2020. And I think that's, for me, it's crazy to think that it wasn't ratified before. But it's a really, I think it's a really important series, and it really teaches us a lot about how women and also Black people fought for their freedom back then. But that was a total sidestep. Yeah, I'll continue. Then it says, this article illustrates.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah,
So you said Equal Rights Amendment
yeah,
was ratified in 2020.
yeah, because the 38, there was already 37 states beforehand who had voted to,
Yeah.
include it in the amendment or to make this amendment, but only the 38 state came in 2020, and first then it could be ratified.
Okay, and what is this ERA?
I don't remember how it sounds. I think it says something.
Oh, okay. I just Googled. It's that's the 28th amendment.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Is it the same as the Equal Rights Act?
Yeah, it's basically it's built on the same principles. 𝗃𝗃𝗴𝗲𝗃𝗃. I think the point of what it says in this amendment is that it says that there should be equalness between the sexes, that they should all, because before the women wasn't included in the 14th amendment, which is talking about equal protection under the law, and women wasn't a part of it, and therefore they wanted this amendment to make them included in the 14th amendment as well. At least that's how I understood it. Maybe I misunderstood everything. I don't think I did. But that's why you should watch it yourself, so you know that what I'm saying.
I Googled now quickly, and as far as I know, that this whole thing has never been ratified. It was in 2020 in the House of Representatives, but the Republicans have used the filibuster to block the measure in the Senate.
Oh, I didn't know that. They didn't mention that in the series.
Okay, no, I'm just.
But that's crazy.
Yeah, since 1923, when it was first suggested, it was never ratified.
It's just, it's
Crazy.
madness that it's not, that it's not included, or that it hasn't been ratified, because, yeah, it's just sad to think about. But the movement back in the history really explains why there was this backlash back then. And there was this huge movement. I think they had 30 states which believed that it should be ratified. But then there was this backlash with a certain person. I don't remember her name. Something about 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃. I don't remember her surname, but she really made a movement against this ERA amendment, or the ERA, because she believed that women would have too much equality, in the sense of that, what did she say? That she didn't believe in women to have equality. She believed that women should be protected by their husbands, and thereby they had some kind of freedom. I don't remember what she said, but it's sickening to hear her point, and what it did, this backlash movement, I think maybe 7 states withdrew their
Yeah,
their
that was this 𝘂𝗶𝗱𝗲𝗲𝗶.
yeah,
She
that's
went. Yeah, okay.
Alright.
did Tess not mention her?
It was Thabo in his series about
Ah. Okay, so that's
yeah.
I've heard her.
But there, the Equal Rights Act played also an important role because that was their rallying cry to go against this, and it was a means of kind of hiding their, I don't know, or empowering their message that they brought. These conservatives,
Yeah.
even conservative women who said, we are going to be we are going to be disadvantaged under this
Yeah.
Equal Rights Act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, forgotten or yeah. That's what I wanted to make a point of before. But yeah, so yeah. So it's I think it's I don't remember why we went talking about this, but yeah, you wanted to say something, Arjen.
Oh, no, I said just go on.
I'll go. Okay.
Bring it in.
Yeah, I'll continue reading. Okay, I'll just begin from this article again. This article illustrates the dynamics that transform conflicts over national identity into constitutional conflicts by examining 3 episodes in the long-standing dispute over whether the United States is a Christian nation. Part 1, which is about the Christian Amendment movement. Part 1 looks at the 19th century movement to amend the Constitution to proclaim national devotion to Jesus Christ, as that part discusses. Some evangelical Christians rejected the Constitution because they considered it a godless document that lacked any expression of religious devotion. Beginning during the Civil War and continuing through the end of the century, they organized a national movement to make the Constitution Christian. The movement was propelled by concerns over the increasing population and power of Catholics, Jews, Seventh-day Adventists, and religious freethinkers. Increasing religious diversity generated a variety of challenges to Protestant preeminence, including objections to Christian prayers and Bible reading in public schools, Sabbath observant laws, and religious oaths. Leaders of the Christian Amendment movement considered these challenges to be nothing less than a war on Christianity and therefore an attack on America itself. The nation's Christian identity could be saved, the movement argued, if only the Constitution could be made Christian. So here it really explains at least some part of what the purpose was of the Christian Amendment movement. They really had this prototype of what they believed to be Christian or to be American, and that prototype was being Christian, and therefore it had to go in the Constitution because the Constitution for them was what the American identity consisted of. And here it's Sabbath observant laws is highlighted, and I think I would say that it's highlighted because we know that in the history of 1888 we have the Sunday laws, and here it mentions Sunday laws, Sabbath observance laws. Then it goes on to say part 2 looks at Judeo-Christian nationalism of the Eisenhower era. Like the Christian Amendment movement, religious nationalists of the 1950s understood religious devotion to be a core aspect of America's national identity, but they developed a more ecumenical rhetoric which valorized the nation's Judeo-Christian heritage rather than its Christian or specifically Protestant faith. In an effort to counter communism abroad and at home, religious nationalists of the 1950s sought ways to gain official recognition of the nation's religious identity. With little opposition, they succeeded in legislative campaigns to add "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and to adopt "In God We Trust" as the national motto. The drive for recognition of the nation's religious identity faltered, however, when it sought to protect the nation's religious identity through a constitutional school prayer amendment. So here we of course talk about the second movement, which also was a failure. And as I understood, the reason why they're not Christian anymore, but Judeo-Christian, is because in this time we just had the Second World War, and we have all the things surrounding Holocaust in Germany, and they don't want to be associated with it. So by adopting Judeo-Christian, they kind of showed that they had that they were supporting Jews. So that's how they were able to, succeed in the legislative campaigns, as it mentioned here in the document. That's a part of why I believe they succeeded, because they were siding with Judean-Christian beliefs instead, or you know what I mean, I hope. I'll continue to read. Part 3 examines the constitutional vision of the new Christian right, the Christian conservative movement, the 𝗂𝗚𝗴𝗲𝗃 in the 1970s, led by tele-evangelist 𝗸𝗵𝗹𝗹𝗃 and Pat Robertson, founders of the Moral Majority in the Christian Coalition. The new Christian right arose to combat a perceived decline in the nation's Christian values through the acceptance of abortion rights, women's rights, gay rights, pornography, and rock music. Although the new Christian right is not ordinarily considered a constitutional movement, it had a well-developed constitutional philosophy. In contrast to the Christian Amendment movement of the 19th century, which condemned the Constitution as godless, the new Christian right insisted that the Constitution embodies Christian values and can only be understood as a charter for a Christian nation. The Constitution must be Christian, these leaders declared, because the American people are Christian. So here we're talking about the last group, which is our time. And we have had so many studies about the moral majority, or not so many, but we have had studies about the moral majority, about abortion rights, which we just mentioned before. And there's so many things to learn about this history, because it's also just so different from the first and the second, because here I don't remember in the Judeo-Christian movement if they wanted to amend it. I think they did, but we see in our time there's not really any amendment. It's just interpreting the Constitution Christian.
I think it was not so much about the Constitution anymore. It was more about the Pledge of Allegiance, where they wanted to include "under God" and the national motto that should be "In God We Trust."
Where?
In the Middle history,
In the second one.
the 1940s and 50s.
But we just read they wanted to amend it because of school prayer amendment.
Oh, still.
I think that's what we read.
Wasn't that in the
That's
first
part two.
history?
The second group. Yeah.
But that was also.
That was
Machine
also in
first.
first, yeah. But I think I actually picked it up and I thought,
Just a moment.
I think it was an issue then in all three needs to have been.
Hold on. How the Constitution became Christian. So the iPad just stopped sharing because it died. It doesn't have any battery. So I'll just try to find it on the computer. Alle bøger. Eller minutter. PDF-dokumenter.
Nej.
Okay, so it is. I think I have it on my
Jeg har den på telefon.
phone. I also have it on my phone. It's okay.
Jeg har fundet den.
Okay. So I can't screen share it with you, but we're not really going to read anymore. I'll just give you some of the main points which are here. Yeah. So I can just write it on the board again. I can just, I'll write it over here. So we just read about these three movements, and there's 3 points or 3 things that are similar in all of the 3 groups, and so the similar pattern that they all follow consists of 3. The first one, the first one is called group thread. The second one is called nationalist framework. And the last one is called constitutional demands. Yeah. Demands? Oh, oops. Demands. So as we talked before, we did talk about the one called group thread, where each of these movements believe that there is a group thread which would take away their Christian preeminence. And the second one is about, it's called nationalist framework, and that this point consists of them believing that the Constitution has a it says here, members of the movement considered religious identity to be a national trait and therefore understood threats to their religious status as an attack on America itself. So, since they believe that the national identity equals religious identity, since they, combined these two, therefore everyone who wasn't in alignment with their identity would, instead attack their identity, since they were, against each other. I don't know if you understand what I mean. Please say if you don't. And the last one is called constitutional demand. I can just read it aloud first. Because each of these movements looked to the Constitution as the ultimate embodiment of national identity, they responded to what they saw as an attack on the nation's religious identity by making demands to amend or interpret the Constitution to entrench that identity. So what it says here is that they made constitutional demands to really fit their agenda or fit their idea of what American identity is, of what they saw to be the core traits of their national essence. Yeah. I can't see my notes, but I don't think that there's any more to this study. She just goes over this briefly, and in the coming study, she should go into these three movements individually. Yeah. So I can just close with a prayer, and then we can stop the video and we can talk or discuss or whatever. Okay? Okay. Dear God in heaven, I thank you for being able to share this study, for being able to talk about these things and seeing how you have led your movement in each time, and that you have called us to not be on the wrong side, but to choose the path that you have given us every day. I pray that you will help us to be aware of those external events around us, so we won't fail the test or go on a wrong path, not knowing which way we're going. May you bless this day, bless the conversations that we have. Help us to really remember these things that you have shared with us, so we can also share them with others. May you take care of this the rest of the day, and bless our conversations about you. Thank you for all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Maybe we should not stop the recording.
Yeah.
When we discuss.
Hun stoppede det.
I didn't stop it yet.